Part 1 Anthropocene, Anthropocene, Neganthropocene 1 The Anthropocene and Neganthropology for Dan Ross, to whom I owe so much. A new critique of anthropology, both philosophical and positive, did this not become necessary from the moment in 2004 when we saw Claude Lévi-Strauss on television admitting that he is preparing to depart a world he no longer loves? If anthropology cannot account for this becoming that so disheartens the anthropologist, does it not thereby lose its legitimacy, just as has occurred to those philosophies that pretend to be unaware of such questions? In other words, what becomes of anthropology in the Anthropocene era? My thesis is this: it becomes a neganthropology, and it must contribute to the advent of the Neganthropocene. We are noetic beings to the extent that we weave psychic secondary retentions on the framework of collective secondary retentions, constituted from psychic and collective pra-individual funds. We individuate ourselves by exteriorizing the pretensions contained within these retentional funds, hidden as potentials that are concretized and actualized through being trans-individuated. This is an organological perspective inasmuch as arrangements of psychic and collective retentions and pretensions are made possible by tertiary retentions, by artificial retentional organs the specific features of which generate pretensional possibilities that are different in each case, and on the basis of which, in each new retentional epoch, trans-individuation metastabilizes new attentional forms that constitute horizons of expectations, wills and desires. This organology is itself a pharmacology to the extent that, generally speaking, tertiary retention both impedes and allows individuation. A new pharmacon carries new possibilities of psychic and collective individuation, and it thus requires therapeutic prescriptions in the form of magic, then religion, then politics, therapeutic prescriptions that constitute practices of care, sacrifice, ritual, worship, deliberation and debate, practices configured by the social systems within which attentional forms emerge. This very general perspective, however, is shown in a new light with the advent of the so-called Anthropocene era. This term is used to refer to the most recent period of geophysical evolution, in which the systemic and massively toxic character of contemporary organology comes to light, especially since the advent of organological industrialization, that is, since the Industrial Revolution, which we must understand is an organological revolution. The question that arises here is exceptional and extraordinary in every respect, and this extraordinariness is overwhelming. How can we live under the weight of a common pretension that is potentially but massively negative on a worldwide scale? The warnings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and 1,000 other current realities bring about expectations and pretensions of the worst, that is, of collapse, not of this or that lost civilization, as Jared Diamond discusses, 36 but of humanity itself and in totality. What is the meaning of belief when, for example, we say that we no longer believe it is possible to change a situation in which the human factor that we now refer to as anthropogenic is, if not a cosmic element, then at least a geological one, and when we do not believe that it is possible to change human behavior? And what is the relationship here between believing, wanting and individuating? What positivity can we fashion from this negative belief, that is, this negative pretension? How might we fight against it without making the mistake of denying its legitimacy, that is, without denying how serious the situation really is? Such negative pretension is inherently performative and self-fulfilling. If in general terms belief is a highly performative form of pretension capable of nurturing a will, then non-belief is a negative performativity that brings dejection, stupefaction and neglect, of which denial is a specific and cowardly form. It is paralysis. To understand the specific question of pretension, of belief, of will and of cowardice in the Anthropocene epoch, we must turn back to what constitutes the pretensional possibilities of the noetic soul in general, that is, of the technical form of life, constituted by its self-exteriorization, in a way that is bound up with the performativity of belief and therefore with will. Noetic pretension, in its elementary content, tenor, and according to Heidegger, is constituted by an arch pretension, which is that of its own end, das in is a sign zum Tod. Such an arch pretension of the end, in relation to which Heidegger never confronted the questions of retentional survival and retentional finitude, and the subsequent projection of my pretensions beyond the instant of my death, has, for hundreds of thousands of years, taken the form of an arch pretension that anticipates the continuation of the reproduction of the human species and the continuing pursuit of the human adventure, that is, of Dasein. In the Anthropocene, that is our Dasein, our existence, what had hitherto been clearly, primordially and spontaneously obvious has been fundamentally disturbed and cracked, if not blocked up and covered over, and the result is the destruction of what has constituted the rational, universal and in this sense, transcendental structure of what Kant called the kingdom of ends. If, in Heideggerian existentialism, every pretensional prospect forming the horizon to come of all Dasein to come is inscribed within the originary ordeal of abandonment, this fundamental moment of anxiety, angst, remained, for it, structurally hidden, denied and forgotten, just as the knowledge of death is forgotten in and through concern, Besorgen, even though it thoroughly orders and controls it. Today, however, every Dasein in the contemporary Anthropocene is constantly invaded by discussions, treated as banal, about the end of the human adventure and the dereliction and abandonment to which all these pretensions are most likely heading, discussions that are all generally conducted in the mode of chatter, dreed. In such a context, the meaning of the word end undergoes radical change. It is first and foremost as this new epoch of negative pretension constituting the banality of the Anthropocene, in which this end is increasingly perceived as highly probable, that Technics challenges us and puts us into question today. It confronts us with an unprecedented question, and this question is all the more daunting given that, at the very time this question arises, we also see the rise of the possibility and the temptation of erasing the very possibility of questioning and being put into question. I should mention here that the arguments along these lines that I put forward in What Makes Life Worth Living 37 in fact depart fundamentally from those of Heidegger. If Dasein is constituted by the possibility of questioning, if being there exists only as being put in question, then it is always organological becoming that puts it into question in the process of a doubly epochal redoubling within which the therapeutic care required by the new organological situation transforms this becoming into a future, that is, transforms this entropy into negantropy. The great organological question in the contemporary Anthropocene is pretension, which simultaneously raises a question and closes off this questioning, in the sense that, faced with a radical negativity brought about by this situation, and insofar as it concerns each of us with respect to our responsibility and our ability to respond to the challenge of being put into question, the data economy has established an industrial and automatized production of pretensions that amounts to guiding them by remote control, or, in other words, it amounts to their annihilation. The combination of the network effect, the self-production of traces, user profiling and real-time supercomputing indeed generates an industrial short-circuit and a systemic elimination of those pretensions that are incalculable, subjecting all will to a form of leveling via what Thomas Burns and Antoinette Rouvroy call algorithmic governmentality. 38, which is the reorganization of psychopower in the era of what Jonathan Crary calls 24/7 capitalism. 39 All noetic activity is governed by pretension. In the existential analytic this is called being towards death, and in psychoanalysis it is called libidinal economy. When fiduciary artifices appear, such as written forms of quantifiable exchange, capital is constituted as a power over pretensions, in the first place through this tertiary pretension that is money. 40 In the contemporary stage of the Anthropocene, it turns out that capital has generated a negative pretension that ruins every economy, existential, libidinal and capitalist. This negative pretension is the pretension of nihil, of nothing, and it is the completion of nihilism foreshadowed by Nietzsche at the moment German capitalism was imposing itself on Europe. What is now called the Anthropocene corresponds to industrial capitalism, where calculation prevails as criterion of decision-making. As such, this constitutes the advent of nihilism. The confusion and disarray into which the reflexive stage of the Anthropocene era has fallen, reflexive because purportedly aware, is nevertheless an historical outcome for which new causal and quasi-causal factors can now be identified that have hitherto received little analysis, and this is why it is correct to reject geocratic understandings of this situation that short-circuit political analyses of that history which unfolds after the beginning of the Anthropocene event. In addition to this historical and political perspective, however, we must add the fact that the Anthropocene event has made patently obvious something that philosophy had, in a structural way, been denying for centuries. The artifact is the mainspring of hominization, its condition and its fate. This can no longer be ignored. What Valery, Husserl and Freud laid out between the two world wars as a new age of humanity, that is, as its pharmacological consciousness and pharmacological unconscious, has become a common awareness and unawareness that is both muddled and unhappy. Such is ill-being in the malaise of the Anthropocene today. It is, therefore, imperative to completely rethink the noetic fact, and to do so in every field of knowledge, whether of living, doing or conceptualizing. This imperative presents itself in the contemporary Anthropocene as an extremely urgent situation vital to both politics and economics, thereby raising a question of practical organology, that is, of inventive productions, which I, along with Ars Industrialis and the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation, ARI, maintain requires a total reinvention of the architecture of the World Wide Web, that technological apparatus through which the Anthropocene has, since 1993, entered into a new epoch. If we are to think the Anthropocene as giving rise to the devaluation of all values, then we must think it with Nietzsche. The vital task for all noetic knowledge in the Anthropocene is the transvaluation of all values, in an age when the noetic soul's calling itself into question occurs as the completion of nihilism. This is the very test and ordeal of our age, and it is the very meaning of the Anthropocene as a name for the age of capitalism's globalization. In this test, the noetic soul is faced with the imperative of thinking thought inasmuch as it is fundamentally a question of pretension, and is the arch-pretension of its being called into question by its organological fate, which constitutes it while also destituting it without recourse. This is something that in fact began long before either the Anthropocene or capitalism, as the pharmacological condition of thinking itself, but today there is no escape from this ordeal, which is that of nihilism. What does this destitution of thinking at the very heart of thinking mean? It means that I think only insofar as there is, in my thinking, a place for what, in that which must still be thought, can and must give space for the unthinkable, that is, for becoming. We must think the transvaluation of becoming into future by reading Nietzsche, and we must read him together with the Marx of 1857, that is, as a thinker of capitalism. Marx and Nietzsche must be read together in the service of a new critique of political economy, in a world where economics has become a key factor, in a way that is localized and yet occurs on a scale that is colossal and indeed cosmic. They must be read, therefore, in the service of an ecology. Such a reading should lead to a process of transvaluation, so that the economic values and moral devalorizations to which nihilism gives rise when it becomes unbridled capitalism can be transvaluated by a new value of values, which is to say, by negantropy. The theory of entropy, deriving from thermodynamics some 30 years after the advent of industrial technology and the beginning of the organological revolution that lies at the origin of the Anthropocene, that is, after the steam engine 41, redefines the question of value, given that the relation entropy-negantropy is really the question of life par excellence. It is with respect to such perspectives that we must think, organologically and pharmacologically, what we should in fact call the Anthropocene and Neganthropology. The contemporary Anthropocene is a test and ordeal of thinking in all its forms, as knowledge of how to do, how to live and how to conceptualize, and as such it requires a new critique of Kantian critique, especially given that what Kant's rational cosmology is incapable of taking into account is, precisely, the organological question. If the schematism originally derives from technical exteriorization and the artifactualization of the world, as I attempted to show in the third volume of Technics and Time, 42, the subtitle of which was The Time of Cinema, and this is what constitutes the transcendental question of arch-cinema. And of arch-cinema as a constant putting into question of spirit by itself, that is, by its concretizations and its exteriorizations, such as the tragedy of the Aufklärung as described by Adorno and Horkheimer, if the schematism originally derives from technical exteriorization and the artifactualization of the world, as I say, then this affects not just the account of the world, but of the cosmos itself. At the dawn of philosophy, the cosmos is thought as identity and equilibrium, in a way that, however, was not the case for pre-Socratic philosophy. In this opposition between equilibrium of ontological origin and the disequilibrium of corruptible beings, technics constitutes the organological condition and is related to the sublunary as the world of contingency, as that which can be otherwise that it is, to indicum all Hein. As such, it finds itself excluded from thought. Such a position, however, is no longer tenable in the Anthropocene, and as such it constitutes an unprecedented epistemic crisis, the advent of the thermodynamic machine, which is the eregness of the Industrial Revolution and of its gestalt, and which showed the human world to be fundamentally characterized by change and disruption, perturbation, inscribes processuality, the irreversibility of becoming and the instability of equilibrium in which all this consists, at the core of physics itself. The thermodynamic machine, which raises, in physics, the new and specific problem of the dissipation of energy, is also an industrial technical object that fundamentally disrupts social organizations, with the result that it radically alters the understanding that Thuribing has of its being. This technical object, of which Watt's flyball governor will prove a key element at the center of the cybernetic conception, this technical object, as essentially combustive, introduces, on both the astrophysical plane, which replaces mythological cosmology, and on the plane of human ecology, the question of fire and of its pharmacology. The question of fire, that is, of combustion, is thus inscribed in the perspectives of both physics and anthropological ecology, at the heart of a renewed thought of cosmos qua cosmos. The Anthropocene epoch can appear as such only starting from the moment when the question of the cosmos is itself grasped as that of combustion, in both astrophysics and thermodynamics, but, therefore, also in relation to this exceptional pharmacon that is domesticated fire, fire as that artifice par excellence delivered to mortals by Prometheus. As a physical problem, the technological conquest of fire, which is the eregness of gestalt, puts anthropogenesis, that is, organological organogenesis, at the heart of what Alfred North Whitehead called concrescence, 43 and does so as the local technicization of the cosmos. This may be only a local technicization, but it leads to conceiving the cosmos in totality on the basis of this position and on the basis of this local opening of the question of fire as that pharmacon of which we must take care. And here, the question of the energy, and energeia, that fire, which is also light, contains, after the organological and epistemological revolution that occurs when Schrödinger rethinks thermodynamics, constitutes the matrix of the thought of life and of information, and does so as the play of entropy and negentropy. Establishing the question of entropy and negentropy for human beings as the crucial problem of daily human life and of life in general, and ultimately of the universe in totality, technics constitutes the matrix of all thinking of oikos, of habitat and of law. At the very moment when Erwin Schrödinger was giving his lectures in Dublin, Georges Canguilhem was arguing that the noetic soul is a technical form of life, and that it requires new conditions of fidelity in order to overcome the shocks of infidelity caused by what I myself refer to as the doubly epochal redoubling. The infidelity of the technical milieu. This is what the organological and pharmacological beings who are noetic individuals encounter in the form of epochal technological shock. This shock and this infidelity are essentially what Simondon referred to as shifting phase, deficit in order to describe the dynamic principle of individuation. We should recall here what Canguilhem posits in principle concerning the more than biological meaning of epist. Knowledge of life is a specific form of life conceived not just as biological but as the vital knowledge of milieus, systems and processes of individuation, where knowledge is the future of life. Here, the concrescence of the cosmos generates processes of individuation in which entropic and negentropic tendencies play out differently in each case. We must relate this organological function of knowledge in the technical form of life to Simondon's account of the knowledge of individuation. For Simondon, To know individuation is to individuate, that is, it is to already no longer know because it is to undergo a phase shift, to become out of phase. Questions of life and negentropy may derive from Darwin and Schrödinger, but they must be redefined in relation to the organological context, given that, 1. Natural selection gives way to artificial selection, and 2. The passage from the organic to the organological displaces the play of entropy and negentropy. 44. Technics is an accentuation of negentropy, since it brings increased differentiation. But it is equally true that technics is an acceleration of entropy, not just because it is a process of combustion and of the dissipation of energy, but because industrial standardization seems to be leading the contemporary Anthropocene to the possibility of the destruction of life qua the burgeoning and proliferation of difference, a destruction of biodiversity, cultural diversity, and the singularity of both psychic individuations and collective individuations. With the concept of process, Whitehead moves beyond seeing natural phenomena and cultural phenomena in oppositional terms, and this is also the very meaning of the Anthropocene. Anthropic activity has become a geophysical factor. In Whitehead, cosmology is no longer a matter of the order of the spheres, but a processual dynamic of nested spirals that materialize regimes of speed. And here, thinking would be that infinite speed of the power to rupture, to effect breaks, that is, to cause bifurcations by disautomatizing repetitive regularities and by changing the rules, power, which is knowledge, and which Whitehead also called history. This power to change the rules, however, also establishes a risk of intersystemic conflict, which von Bertalanffy studied in his General System Theory 45, which inscribes the pharmacological question at the center of cosmology, and does so as the anthropotechnical, bispherical and local consequence of the initial combustion and its universal thermodynamic law. This is why Whitehead could write that the major advances in civilization are processes that all but wreck the societies in which they occur. 46 To change the rules is to go faster than light insofar as the latter has become, as the speed of digital automatons, the horizon of the calculation industry. It is to go infinitely fast, at the speed of desire, that is, of that idealization via which negantropy passes onto the plane of consistences. This raises the question of those laws of the universe that constitute the field of physics, and that form the set of rules of a game we cannot change, but that we can localize, that we can play by interpreting it in a localized way, that is, by liberating potentials for individuation through the artifactual organization of inorganic sidereal play. This is what occurs, for instance, with nanophysics, emerging as it does from quantum technology. Above all, technics consists in the organization of inorganic matter, leading in return to the organological reorganization of cerebral organic matter, which in its turn organologically modifies the play of the somatic organs, giving rise to a new form of life, that is, a new form of negentropy, which is nevertheless also, as technics, an accelerator of entropy on every cosmic level. It is this two-sidedness that characterizes the pharmacon. Toxic means entropic. An example of a nanotechnological organ is the scanning tunneling microscope, which is itself a computer. This arrangement between the cerebral organ and the quantum scale of hypermatter is a stage of concrescence that here also amounts to a process of concretization in the larger Simondonian sense, operating on all cosmic planes at once, sidereal, vital and psychosocial, that is, technical. This localization is a striking example of anthropotechnical retroaction on the play of the bispherical whole, within which it spreads and generalizes by locally generating this extraordinary stage of concrescence that is the Anthropocene. While respecting the laws of physics, technics locally transforms the cosmic order in unpredictable ways. Hence the concretization of the technical individual, that is the machine, whose functioning is not soluble into the laws of physics, tends to form associated technogeographical milieus. According to Simondon, this tendency implies the need for a mechanology, but I believe it can more fruitfully be understood in terms of an organology, given that mechanology does not allow us to think either pharmacology or the links between psychic, technical and collective individuation. Process, concrescence, disturbances, infidelities of milieus and of every metastable equilibrium, that is, metastable disequilibrium, all form what, in our age, presents itself to us as what we are causing within ourselves, around us and between us. It is what we are causing as the projection of a becoming that our organological and pharmacological condition no longer allows us to succeed in transforming into a future, that is, as the play between the processes of psychic, technical and collective, that is, social, individuation, where the latter form the three dimensions through which and within which our existence always occurs, bound by their mutual organological condition. With the control of pretensions by a capitalism that has become structurally entropic, the contemporary Anthropocene seems to condemn psychic and collective individuation to being wiped out by a technical individuation that has become subject to a self-destructive economy, given that it destroys those social milieus without which the technical milieu inevitably becomes a negative externality that in turn destroys the physical milieus of the biosphere. The organological approach is constitutively situated in time in the sense that its object is becoming, and its question is the transformation of becoming into future, which means that what is at issue is the transformation of entropy into negantropy. It is a practical approach whereby becoming, for which there can be no complete theory, no ontology, requires inventiveness. It requires an inventivity that would be the pharmacological and organological counterpart of what White had called creativity. Within such an approach, we must begin by describing the situation in which we now find ourselves organologically and pharmacologically immersed, and on the basis of which we can accede, as Dasein, to the historiality, Geschichtlichkeit, of A being organologically there, that is A being pharmacologically there. But here, historiality is not conceived as in Heidegger, namely, ontologically, but as in Simondon, that is, as an ontogenesis, but with the corollary that this is understood, contrary to Simondon, as an artfactual ontogenesis. According to such an approach, our situation at the end of November 2014, aside from the widespread recognition of the inherently pharmacological dimension of development, is marked by the new and unprecedented questions presented to us by digital technology. Digital technology, which completely reconfigures the globalized industrial infrastructure, is the unavoidable path we must follow, and we cannot escape the question of a pharmacology and a therapeutics that places the digital becoming of the world at the very center of what must be decided, as the organon of this decision and or of this indecision. This is why I, along with Ars Industrialis and IRI, and with the Digital Studies Network, have implemented our organological project from the perspective of what we call digital studies. Digital studies posits in principle that everything begins with exteriorization, and in particular with the digits, that is, with the foot and the hand. 47 Digital studies refers, firstly, to the study of the materiality and or the corporeality of knowledge, that is, of the incorporation and materialization of noetic fluxes. Like writing, like the steam engine, the programmable loom and machine tools, like analog devices, like all of these, the computer, especially when it becomes what Michel Val calls a ubiquitous programmable automaton. 48 That is, the terminal of a network, is what causes a change in the relationships between knowledge and techniques or knowledge and technology, and, through these relationships, a change in knowledge itself in all its forms. In this way, a new organological epoch of knowledge is constituted, amounting to a new epist that calls for specific concepts. The reticular computer raises anew all those questions first posed by Socrates in relation to the question of the pharmakon, multiplying them by a factor of 4 million, which is the difference between, on the one hand, the speed of nerve impulses that circulate at 50 meters per second along the nerves that are the reticulation of our bodies, 49 and, on the other hand, the speed of information on fiber optic networks running along the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, where information circulates via specialized connections serving high-frequency trading at 200 million meters per second 50. These questions put back into play the entire relationship between techniques, knowledge, politics and economics, that is, powers. The status of the steam engine, just like that of the computer, is at once epistemic, epistemological, political and economic, and we cannot approach either of them without considering all these dimensions. In fact, the overtaking of the speed of nervous transmission by the speed of fiber optics, which is also the overtaking of the speed of reason by an understanding that has become automatic, brings the problem of proletarianization, which every pharmacon always involves, to that ultimate point that is completed. Nihilism. And, as such, it demands a reconsideration of the organological, arch-cinematographic, conditions of the Kantian schematism. To pose questions of science, politics and economics from an organological perspective is to posit in the most general way possible their indissoluble character, and to bind them transductively to a method that absolutely excludes pure scientific objectivity. It excludes any objectivity that would not be performative, that is, incomplete. In Whitehead's sense, for there is concrescence only to the extent that there is this incompleteness. And it is this incompleteness that also constitutes the process of individuation in Simondon, for whom the question of the scheme and the category arises from this processual perspective. To in principle posit the incompleteness of the cosmos, and thereby inscribe a performative possibility that would exceed any scientific objectivity, obviously does not rule out all scientific objectification and objectivity. Rather, it means that the cosmic process contains something that cannot be objectified, and that the cosmos is not reducible to physics as a stable set of laws, in this case because physics is organological, that is, because it leads to the introduction, into the cosmos, of the pharmacon, that is, the incompleteness in which it radically consists, and in this sense knowledge of life is a struggle not just for life but for existence, wherein to know individuation consists in individuating and therefore in never quite knowing it entirely. This thesis is not Whitehead's but mine. Scientific objectivity is always related to a particular organological state given at that time, and also to a given locality. Organology has an irreducibly local dimension. This point of view suggests that there are indeed grounds on which one could contest the term general organology, as Riccardo Baldissone has done, except and unless one gives to words such as genre, generales and generality a new meaning, whereby the word general would mean trans-individuated on the three planes of organological becoming. The singularity of the Anthropocene as an organological epoch lies in the fact it has generated the organological question itself, hence in the fact it is constituted by its own recognition, a recognition bringing with it something new, its negative pretension and the necessity of overcoming itself. The question of the Anthropocene is how to exit from the Anthropocene quatoxic period in order to enter into a new epoch that we are calling the Neganthropocene, as a curative, careful epoch. In practical terms this means that, on the economic plane, value accumulation should be undertaken exclusively with a view to neganthropic investments. The question of the Anthropocene, which, therefore, has the structure of a promise, emerges at the moment when, on the other hand, full and general automation is being set in place as one outcome of the industry of reticular digital traces. This reticulation industry must be thought as the chance for a new epoch of work, where the epoch of employment will be brought to an end, and where this will occur through a transvaluation of value, wherein, as Marx put it, labor time ceases and must cease to be the measure of work or labor, and hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. 51 In this situation, the value of value becomes neganthropy. What remains to be accomplished is thus the passage to the Neganthropocene, and in saying this I am continuing a discussion with Maurizio Lazzarato that I opened in Automatic Society, Volume 1. It was Socrates who first posed the question of the trace, of its interiorization and exteriorization. This was the first formulation of the pharmacological question, the question of the trace as the thread of proletarianization inherent in all knowledge, given that all knowledge is exteriorized. It is on this very basis that we must analyze today's globalized industry of reticulated traces, the organ of which is the reticulated computer, operating on the basis of the network effect, the self and auto-generation of traces, and the real-time calculation applied to these traces on a planetary scale, technologies that produce what Burns and Rouvroy call algorithmic governmentality. The algorithmic governmentality of 24/7 capitalism leads to the formation of artificial crowds, in Freud's sense, commenting on Le Bon, this being the origin of crowdsourcing, that is, of the data economy, such as the contemporary reality of the Anthropocene quad-digital stage of grammatization, leading psychic individuals throughout the entire world to grammatize their own behavior by interacting with computer systems operating in real time. These systems produce an automatic performativity that channels, diverts and short-circuits individual and collective pretensions, by outstripping and overtaking the noetic capacities of individuation, and doing so precisely insofar as the latter are pretensional capacities, that is, oniric capacities. And, at the same time, by short-circuiting the collective production of circuits of trans-individuation. This outstripping and overtaking of every form of gnosis operates via the incitement, by remote control, of pretensions that are continuously being redefined and are always already erased by new pretensions that prove ever more disintegrated, that is, that show themselves to be individuals, in Guattari's sense. This short-circuiting of psychic and collective pretensions, replaced by automatically generated pretensions, impedes dreaming, wanting, reflecting and deciding, that is, the collective realization of dreams. And these obstructions are ultimately a systemic impediment to thinking, which then constitutes the basis of algorithmic governmentality as the power structure of computationally integrated 24/7 capitalism. The analyses by Jonathan Crary and by Burns and Rouvroy of the computationalization of behavior generated by the digital doubles of user profiling should be combined with Alan Greenspan's reflections on the effects of automating financial transactions, enabling the formation of a system also referred to as the financial industry, where we find both subprime mortgages and speculative technologies such as credit default swaps and high-frequency trading, all founded on increasing speed. 52 Burns and Rouvroy do not denounce the existence of digital doubles as such. Their conclusion, on the contrary, is that our statistical double is too detached from us. 53 This detachment arises because the data industry, as the automated production and exploitation of traces, dispossesses us of the possibility of interpreting our retentions and pretensions, both psychic and collective. To change this situation, this state of fact, and open up the possibility for a new state of law, which Antoinette Rouvroy calls for, we must invent an organology based on the potentials contained in the digital technical system, even though currently this system does indeed give every appearance of being a giant technical individual, a digital leviathan that exerts its power over the entire earth, and does so through its ability to continually outstrip and overtake everything on behalf of a decadent, uncultivated and self-destructive oligarchy, because it is an absolutely venal oligarchy, that is, perfectly nihilistic. This contemporary leviathan is global, and it is the result of the reticular and interactive traceability of 24/7 capitalism. Most people now have a general awareness of this situation, and thus this traceability does not operate behind the back of consciousness, as Hegel said about the phenomenology of spirit, of its epiphany as exteriorization, but rather by outstripping and overtaking the pretensions that produce this consciousness, that is, by proposing and substituting prefabricated pretensions, and these pretensions are prefabricated even if they are also individualized or personalized. All this represents a radical and unprecedented rupture with Husserl's description of the temporal activity of noetic consciousness. The latter is composed of primary retentions that consciousness selects, without being aware of doing so, at the time the experience occurs, selections made on the basis of the secondary retentions this consciousness contains. Secondary retentions thereby constitute the criteria for these selections. The primary retentions resulting from this selection engram individually lived experience, and contribute to the accumulation of past experience, by in their turn becoming secondary retentions. The play between primary and secondary retentions generates pretensions that are themselves primary and secondary, though Husserl did not make this distinction. Primary pretensions are tied to the object of lived experience, so that through habit, reasoning, physiological automatisms, or through the knowledge that the perceiving subject accumulates about the object of perception, such primarily retained traits result in primarily protein traits, that is, expected and anticipated traits, whether consciously or otherwise. These primary and secondary retentions and pretensions constitute mosaic traces, which, like the neurons in Freud's project for a scientific psychology, are charged with and tend towards pretensions, through circuits and facilitations formed between these msic traces that Freud called contact barriers, as potentials for action and as expectations that constitute the lived experience of these potentials. 54. This play of retentional and pretensional msic traces is conditioned and overdetermined by the play of those hypomnesic traces formed by tertiary retention. In the case of digital and reticulated tertiary retention, that is, arrangements of psychic retentions and pretensions via automatisms whose speed approaches that of light, the retentional selections through which experience occurs as the production of primary retentions and pretensions are overtaken by prefabricated tertiary retentions and pretensions that are tailored through user profiling and auto-completion technologies, and through all the possibilities afforded by real-time processing and its associated network effects and augmented by this performativity. Given this differential of 4 million between the speed of nerves and that of fiber optics, such considerations call for an organology and a pharmacology of speed and will. For it is will in its most basic forms that is thereby emptied of all content and overtaken by traceability. We must elaborate an organology of will, and not just of desire, of will, volition as including every kind of production of motives, of which willpower, volonté qua deliberate and conscious production is merely one case among others, which does not mean that we should dilute the specificity of each of them, quite the contrary. We must work towards an organology of will, the goal of which would be to pose the challenges of the Anthropocene and the Neganthropocene by, precisely, rethinking practical questions in relation to this organology. This is necessary because the hypermatter in which this organological matter consists enables control to be taken of the material processes that condition will and willpower, and thereby short-circuits them in every dimension, replacing them with automatized pretensions. When a noetic individual undergoes a temporal experience in which he or she selects primary retentions on the basis of his or her secondary retentions, this individual at the same time, and in return, 55 interprets these secondary retentions inasmuch as they form ensembles. Such ensembles are charged with pretensions arising from previous experiences. Some of these pretensions are trans-individuated and transformed into rules held in common, that is, into habits and conventions of every kind, metastabilized between the psychic individual and the collective individuals associated with these experiences, a convention being what is convenient to, suitable for, a plurality of individuals. What makes them come together? Some of these pretensions, however, remain awaiting trans-individuation, that is, they await expressions and inscriptions that pursue existing circuits of trans-individuation further. For a psychic individual to interpret, during a present experience, the ensembles of secondary retentions that constitute his or her past experience is to make actual the pretensions that these ensembles contain as potential 56 by short-circuiting the pretensional projections of psychic and collective noetic individuals, by phagocytically absorbing the milieus associated with them, and by sterilizing the circuits of trans-individuation that are woven between them through their individual and collective experiences. By doing all this, algorithmic governmentality annihilates the traumatypical potentials of any pretensions that might bear the possibility of neganthropological upheavals. Such is computational nihilism in the contemporary Anthropocene. When noetic experience is fulfilled in actuality and fully, in the plenitude of actuality that constitutes what Aristotle called entelechy, it constitutes a support for the expression of trauma types that participate in the inscription of noetic singularity into circuits of trans-individuation, circuits through which knowledge is woven as the accumulation of previous experience insofar as it is original and yet recognized and identified. As such, noetic experience is experience that is neganthropically bifurcating. It is a question, therefore, of how to re-establish a true process of trans-individuation with digital, reticulated tertiary retentions, and to bring about a digital age of psychic and collective individuation. The challenge is to generate tertiary retentions with all the polysemic and plurivocal thickness of which the hypomnesic trace is capable, reflecting the hermeneutic play of the improbable and of the singularity involved in the pretensions that are woven between psychic and collective retentions. To do this, We must build and implement systems dedicated to the individual and collective interpretation of traces, including by using automated systems that enable analytical transformations to be optimized, and new materials to be supplied for synthetic activity. This is what we are working towards, organologically, with the goal of rebuilding the architecture of the World Wide Web, and is a way of responding to the call issued by Tim Berners-Lee in London last September with his initiative entitled The Web We Want. As for us, what we want is a neganthropic web, and we want it so that we can inaugurate the Neganthropocene to escaping the Anthropocene. 1. Automation and negantropy. The propositions at the heart of this paper are founded on the conclusions of my recent work entitled Automatic Society, a book concerned with the issues of full and general automation that have accompanied